Awesome. Thank you guys for logging in tonight. I know it's a Thursday night. Probably have so much you have to do. So thank you guys for joining us for the kickoff webinar for the 2025 Community Science Long Island webinar series. My name is Ariel Santos. I'm a conservation scientist with SeaTuck Environmental Association, and I'll be moderating tonight's webinar. The goal of the Community Science LI series is to highlight various community science and environmental volunteer opportunities around Long Island and how the data accumulated by the public influences local environmental management efforts. The series is a collaboration between SeaTuck Environmental Association, Long Island Sound Study, New York Sea Grant, Peconic Estuary Partnership, and the South Shore Estuary Reserve. For the first time in CSLI, we also partnered with LISMA, the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area, to bring you a whole series on invasive species. So just a little background of the collaborators of this series, if you're not familiar with us already. SeaTuck is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to conserving Long Island wildlife and the environment. The Long Island Sound Study is a bi-state partnership consisting of federal and state agencies, user groups, concerned organizations, and individuals dedicated to restoring and protecting the sound. New York Sea Grant represents a statewide network of integrated research, education, and extension services promoting coastal community economic vitality, environmental sustainability, citizen awareness, and understanding about the state's marine and Great Lakes resources. The Peconic Estuary Partnership is a national estuary program that works to protect and restore the Peconic Estuary. PEP staff and partners support monitoring, research, collaboration, and education to address priority issues within the Peconic Estuary and its watershed. The South Shore Estuary Reserve Program guides the preservation, protection, and enhancement of the natural, recreational, economic, and educational resources of the estuary through partnerships with a diverse group of stakeholders, including state, federal, and local organizations. And last but not least, LISMA is a voluntary partnership of many organizations from Staten Island, Long Island, including Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk, and 11 additional coastal plain islands. They're one of 8 PRISMs, Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, that cover all of New York State. LISMA's mission is to reduce the threat of invasive species to the environment, economy, and human health, and protect local ecosystems on Long Island and in New York City by cultivating collaborative partnerships with diverse stakeholders. So tonight's webinar will cover the invasive Phragmites, Phragmites australis, or common reed, which is non-native, fast-spreading wetland grass found across Long Island. Its aggressive growth displaces native species and degrades wetland and aquatic habitats. In this webinar, you will learn how to identify Phragmites, understand its impact, and discover ways you can help protect native plants and wildlife by preventing its spread. The people who will teach us all this important information are Steve Young and Caitlin Matei. First up is Steve Young. Steve is a botanist who worked for 31 years as the chief botanist for the New York Natural Heritage Program, where he explored natural areas all over New York State, inventorying and studying its rare plants. He was the coordinator of LISMA for 6 years in the 2010s and continues to assist IMAP, the DEC Invasive Species Program, and the statewide PRISMs with botanical expertise. He has a bachelor's degree in forestry from SUNY ESF and a master's degree in plant taxonomy from the University of Florida. He continues to study New York's flora, especially on Long Island and in the Adirondacks, with his consulting business, Botany Visible. And after that, we have Katie. As a conservation project manager, Katie focuses primarily on SeaTuck's efforts to improve local diadromous fish populations, preserve riparian habitat, and being an advocate for dam removal on Long Island. Much of her work currently involves facilitating planning and implementation projects for fish passage in our local streams. She also manages an invasive species management project to restore and maintain native habitat at a site on the South Shore, which we'll learn about a little later. Often, she coordinates conversations, meetings, and site visits with the various contractors, partners, and stakeholders involved in these projects. Additionally, she manages the annual LI Volunteer River Herring and American Eel Survey that collects essential data on migratory fish runs, such as stream location and approximate observed population. Then she uses the data to compare past migration seasons to monitor any potential trends that can help determine priority sites for future aquatic connectivity restoration projects. I'm almost done, I promise. Just some housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded, and the webinar will be available on CTUC's website shortly after the webinar concludes. Your video and microphones are turned off, but you're free to ask questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you don't have a question but want to share a resource or discuss amongst the group, you're more than welcome to use the chat box. So with that, I will pass it over to Steve.
Okay, let me share my screen here. Here we go. How's that look?
Looking good.
Okay, good. All right, well, I'll do an introduction to the Phragmites plant. And first, I'd like to start out with just a little bit on what invasive species are. And this is the definition on the imapinvasives.org site. And they're basically non-native plants that their introduction causes are likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Or they could really mess up your visit by friends too, for a little coffee clutch there. And how do they do that? Well, if we look at this stand of Phragmites here along the Nisqually River, they compete with native species for natural resources and space. You can just imagine what that shoreline would look like without Phragmites, what native species would be there. They degrade, weaken, and alter the habitats of native ecological communities. That shoreline and floodplain is totally altered into, now it's a common reed marsh. And they can damage agriculture, inhibit recreational opportunities like fishing here, and make property owners spend money to control them or remedy their efforts. So I don't know who this belongs to, but they could probably spend a lot of money trying to get rid of this Phragmites. And remedy their effects too is something like emerald ash borer that kills the ash trees on your property, and then you have to spend money to take them down. All right, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the taxonomy too, since I'm a taxonomist, which is someone who identifies and names plants. I'll talk about the nomenclature, the name of Phragmites australis. And after the name australis, there's that cav trin ex stud. What does that mean? And you often see that after scientific names of plants, it'll have the authors of the plants. So this is something you might not have heard about before, but way back in 1799, Phragmites was first named by Antonio Cavanilles from Spain, and he named it Arundo australis. So he had it in a different genus. And then Carl von Trinius from Germany, he was a German agrostologist or somebody who studies grasses, came along and he called it Phragmites. But he didn't really publish that name. Then somewhat later, Ernst Gottlieb von Studel was another German botanist, agrostologist, and he first used the name Phragmites australis in 1840. And then he formally published it in 1841. So that's why his name is up there last, and they're all abbreviated. But he gave the credit to Trinius for the name. So that's why it says Cav in parentheses here, the first person to name it. Then Trinius ex Stud. So Stud gave credit to Trinius in the naming of the plant. Here's a nice stand in the Woodlawn Preserve in Schenectady. Okay. So the genus Phragmites is modern Latin from the Greek phragmites, growing in hedges, or from phragma, meaning hedge or fence. And it certainly does make a hedge in wetlands out there. I have the sort of the way that most people say it, Phragmites. I have heard it said, pronounced as Phragmites or Phragmite, but I think the proper pronunciation is Phragmites. And Australis, the species name, means southern. So it was thought that the species originated in the Middle East. It's a Eurasian plant in Europe and Asia, native over there, and possibly because it was named in southern Europe, in Spain. Here's a nice stand at Gateway National Recreation Area in Jamaica Bay. So the common names, there's a lot of common names for Phragmites. So one of the most common names is common reed or common reed grass. Sometimes it's called giant reed. There's another grass that's also called giant reed, which I'll get to. Just Phragmites or frag. So oftentimes we'll just say, oh, there's the Phragmites over there, or that place has been fragged, or just frag. Now, if you distinguish the native Phragmites, which there is a native Phragmites, and the Old World Phragmites, those can be distinguished too with common names. Old World reedgrass, Old World Phragmites versus American reedgrass or American Phragmites. And sometimes they're just called exotic Phragmites and native Phragmites, which I tend to use a fair amount. And I'll explain those differences in the native and the exotic. Here's a nice stand of the Old World Phragmites coming into Little Northwest Creek in East Hampton. This was taken a while ago, so I don't know how much further this has marched into this salt marsh since then. So there's three main lineages of Phragmites in North America. And the first one is our native Phragmites, Phragmites australis subspecies americanus. In New York, we call it Phragmites americanus. We call it at the species level. And it's been here a long time, thousands of years, and that's its distribution there. Then we have the Gulf Coast lineage, and this is Phragmites berlandieri. It's a southern lineage which comes up into the southern United States. So we don't have that up here, but they do down along the Gulf Coast and over into California. And then we have the introduced lineage, or Phragmites australis. And we think it's, and you can see the wide distribution of that now, since it's been here since the late 1700s or early 1800s, and probably came in ship ballast. So there's an herbarium specimen of this from Maryland from 1698 at the British Museum. So it's been here a long time. It's hard to do these slides. Okay. And I just wanted to show you, I was over in the Netherlands not too long ago, and this is what the Phragmites looks like over there along a pond. You can see it on the left there. It's not really huge or anything, or not very dense. And below it there's a little stand of butterbur, which we also have in New York. This is the European one, which tends to escape vegetatively too in New York. And then on the right is a windmill, and you can see the sides of the windmill and the roof of the windmill are thatch, and that thatch is made from Phragmites. So that whole windmill is covered in stems of Phragmites. Now, if you want to get more information on how to distinguish the native and the exotic form of Phragmites, this is a really good field guide called Phragmites Field Guide by Swearingen and Saltonstall. So I don't have the QR code here, but if you just take a picture of this or screenshot, you can or write this down. Phragmites Field Guide has a really good ID tips on how to distinguish the two kinds. And here are some of the easiest ways to distinguish the two. On the upper left, the exotic Phragmites has or the native Phragmites has that red leaf collar, whereas the invasive does not, where the sheath meets the blade. And also in the native, the stems also tend to be purple, especially later in the summer into the fall. And the leaves that cover the stem tend to fall off and reveal that red color. The invasive Phragmites is always just green. And then on the lower left, the invasive one has no fungal spots. The native has fungal spots because it's been here longer and probably developed a relationship with those fungi, whereas the invasive one has not. And the invasive tends to be more robust than the native. The native's a little wimpy. You can see on the lower right there, the native inflorescence is kind of wimpy. It's not really that big and full like the invasive one on the left. So those are the ways that you can tell the two apart. On Long Island, as far as I know, there's only one native stand. And so you probably won't run into it very much. And if you do, you should report it to the Natural Heritage Program, Rich Ring there, because they keep track of it, of where they are. It's fairly rare, actually, throughout the state. Now here in Burgeon Swamp, west of Rochester in Genesee County, they have both the exotic and the native lineages. And you can see on the left is the exotic, and on the right is the native Phragmites. And you can kind of see how the Phragmites on the right is a little bit smaller, not as robust as the invasive Phragmites on the left. And then in New York, we think it was introduced in the probably the 1820s or 1830s, probably even before that. And then scientists really, the botanists started to pick up on where it was. And this is a map of a car, the what's called the house cards in the State Museum. They kept track of all the specimens that they made, and they put a dot on a map where they collected them. So this was probably through the 70s of where they had collected Phragmites around the state. And you can see it does follow the corridor of disturbance. Okay, so as far as identification goes, Phragmites is really our tallest running grass. So you can see there on the lower left, there's a picture of Phragmites with a man or a person standing next to it. And it does grow up to 15 feet tall. So it's tall. And I guess probably native Phragmites is the tallest native grass that we have. And this exotic is one that is very tall, and also it's rhizomatous. So it runs underground and above the ground. So on the upper right, you can see a rhizome that is an underground stem with the roots coming out of it. And this is one that has washed out onto the beach. So you can see it pretty easily, but there's very extensive rhizome stems underneath the ground in these stands. And then below, it also has what are called stolons. And stolons are these above ground stems which which grow out above the ground and put out new upright stems with leaves and flowers on them. So it's very successful underground and above the ground. Now there are other large grasses on Long Island too. So how can you tell these from Phragmites? Well, the top picture is giant reed, Arundo donax, and this one, the one below it, maiden grass or eulalia, and Ravenna grass are all clumping grasses. Even though they're very tall, giant reed can get up to 30 feet tall. They're clumping grasses, so they form tighter clumps. And they don't run all over the place and form large hedges or large areas like Phragmites does. And giant reed, as I said, grows up to 30 feet tall. It's grown as a horticultural plant. You might see it around. Maiden grass, or sometimes called Chinese silvergrass, on the lower left is um, fairly common in the horticulture trade. I think it's banned now, but the biggest stand I've seen is at Heckscher State Park, which I think is where that picture is taken. And then in the winter, you often see the old inflorescences curled over. And then on the right is Ravenna grass, Drapidium ravenni, and that one is fairly new to Long Island. So there may be only a few, one or two stands of this on the island, but we really have to keep our eyes out for this to make sure it doesn't expand more. But that one, again, you can see how clumped it is. And it gets to about the same height as Phragmites. So let's talk about the habitats where Phragmites is invasive. Mainly disturbed habitats. It likes disturbed soil habitats and wetlands. So we see it on roadsides, construction sites, wetlands along agricultural fields, developed shorelines like this picture at Pine Lake on Middle Island. And sometimes you'll see it in mitigation wetlands where they come in and do a mitigation wetland and construct a new wetland and put all native plants in, and then they forget about it for a few years and Phragmites comes in because they really disturb the soil. Here's a very common site in the Northeast, especially Long Island and other places in the Northeast where Phragmites grows in roadside ditches. This is in Lewis, Delaware, just where the Cape May Lewis Ferry is. It also gets into natural areas like tidal freshwater to brackish wetlands. So we have these tidal freshwater wetlands along the Hudson River going north from New York, and you like this one at Iona Island on the top there. And in the back, in the front, you see mostly cattail, but in the back, you see that light tan. That's all Phragmites. And they really worked a lot on getting rid of this Phragmites at Iona Island. But it forms extensive stands in a lot of the freshwater marshes along the Hudson. And then below, you'll see one at a more higher salinity salt marshes and things like that on Long Island. This one at Jones Beach, where it also is very successful. Now, the rhizomatous plants can stand a salinity up to 23%, and the juvenile plants just 12%. So it does tend to spread by rhizomes in these wetlands. It's also very successful in non-tidal freshwater and brackish wetlands. So, for example, in on the South Fork and near Riverhead, you have a lot of coastal plain ponds, like Peasy's Pond and Grassy Pond, and Phragmites is starting to get into those ponds in a big way. Probably in the mid 90s is when it really started to come in to those ponds. And LISMA and other organizations have really been working to try and keep it out of those ponds, which is great. And down below is a brackish pond in Syracuse by the baseball stadium there called Onondaga Salt Marsh. And because there's a lot of salt springs there around Syracuse, and Phragmites has gotten in there in a big way too. So what are the effects that Phragmites has when it gets into an area? Well, it can completely change an ecological community. So, for example, here at Nat Peak State Park, you have these beautiful interdunal swales, freshwater interdunal swales, and full of native plants. And the only exotic plant is Phragmites, and it's coming in a big way. So this interdunal swale will eventually turn into a common reed marsh. These are not tidal here, these freshwater ones. And this has already happened in some places. Jones Beach, some of those interdunal soils have turned into reed marshes, common reed marshes. And you can imagine all of the animals, too, insects and other animals that use all those native plants in those marshes. It also creates dense patches that excludes other plants and animals. On the left, you can see Phragmites has recently come in, and you can still see ferns and some other plants interspersed between the stems of the Phragmites. But on the right, after Phragmites has been there for a long time, there's hardly any plants that you can see. It's just total Phragmites stems, excluding everything. It affects the hydrology of wetlands. It can raise the surface of wetlands. It can prevent water from going in and out like it used to. It has high transpiration. It can affect the dryness of a wetland and pull water out of a wetland faster than if it was just native plants. So it does have a big effect on the hydrology once it gets in there. And one other thing that most people, a lot of people don't know about is its effect on fire. So especially I know on Staten Island, they've really been trying to fight to cut back the reed stands because they cause big fires and have burned the stands and then also the nearby houses. So that's an overview of what Phragmites is. And from there, I'll turn it over to Caitlin, and she can talk about her project.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. That was great background. Kate, if you want to just stop sharing your screen, and then Katie, you can go ahead and share yours.
Okay. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. So today my portion of the talk will be talking specifically about Westbrook and our efforts of keeping the frag at bay at this site here in Long Island. And for those, I'm sure most of you know if you signed for this webinar, there is an in-person portion of this as well. It would be this Saturday. Hopefully we don't get rained out. If I will have to make the call by tomorrow. If it looks like it's going to rain too much on Saturday, I might have to unfortunately cancel this. Um, but we have an in-person frag pull. We have a couple of them throughout the year. We also have, if Saturday's canceled, we have one in August and one in September. And you could check out our website to see if you're interested in any of those future dates. And of course, next year as well, we'll have at least 5 that we're going to have at the site. I won't go too much into my introduction because Ariel already did a great job of introducing me, but my name is Caitlin Matei. I'm a conservation project manager at CTUC, and I'll be specifically talking about Westbrook and the frag pulls that we've been doing. So to start off with my presentation, we've liked to use this map in the past for other talks, and it's just really great to show just the topography of Long Island and how our rivers and streams formed from the ice age and the glaciers here. And this is a digital elevation map that was created by Brent Beddington at Hofstra University. And like I said, it's just a great way to really show you or for you to visualize how our rivers and streams were created because of the glaciers. So there was this huge outwash pan that, or outwash plain, I'm sorry, that was downstream of the glaciers. And this stretched for 500 or 100 miles. I'm trying to next it. No, it's not going. Okay. So as the glaciers were melting and as sea level rose, obviously it shrunk down to its present day state. And the runoff or the outwash from the glaciers started creating these small valleys and channels. And as seawater continued to rise and groundwater rose as well, these valleys were filled in and essentially created the rivers and streams that we have here now on Long Island. We have approximately just over 140 streams and rivers across Long Island in both Nassau and Suffolk counties. And again, this is just a really great way to show the rich geological history that we have here in Long Island. So I'm sure most of you might know this already, but a lot of our Long Island streams and rivers are relatively small, especially considering other streams and rivers in other parts of the state or even other parts of the country. In many places where you see these rivers and streams, you could easily hop over them or wade through them without any issue. And they're all groundwater fed, mostly cold water in places that are free flowing. And an important part of the terrestrial landscape of Long Island is the connection between the uplands, the estuaries, and the oceans, where they help transport wildlife, sediment, and energy back and forth between these habitats. And it's just a really great connecting piece between these uplands and our coastal ecosystems. And as not just the plants and the habitat itself, but another important part of that connection are the various animals and insect species that also move back and forth up and down between these different ecosystems and between these streams and estuaries and the oceans as well. So today, like I already kind of mentioned, I will be discussing Westbrook specifically. It's a special spot here we have on Long Island, and we've kind of adopted it as our case study or like our success story for what dam removal or dam failure can look like if we really put all of our efforts into maintaining or restoring natural habitat. So you might have heard about the dam failures that we had last summer at Stump Pond in Blydenburg County Park and the Stony Brook Mill Pond. Westbrook is similar to that aspect. It was one of the earlier dam failures that we had in recent years. This dam failure occurred in 2019. Um, so like I said, it's just a really great way to show what those sites could potentially look like if we let the nature take its course, basically. And one really interesting thing about Westbrook is that it is one of the few streams on Long Island that is nearly completely free of barriers. And by barriers, I mean dam-like structures. So from the headwaters all the way up in Bayard Cutting Arboretum State Park, all the way down to the tidal reaches of the Great South Bay, the last remaining barrier was blown out in 2019. So this is now a fully free-flowing system. So a little bit of history. Many of the streams and rivers that we have here on Long Island were dammed for specific purposes back in the 18th or 19th century, even the 20th century as well. And they were not just for aesthetic or scenic purposes. They were usually for things like power and grist mills and sawmill operations. At one point in time, Long Island had a pretty large cranberry industry here, and even ice harvesting was a popular reason for damming these rivers and streams before refrigeration. In the case of so by present day, many of these dams no longer serve a purpose. And what we're now trying to do is help fish and other species like river otters make their way past these dams. Because for a lot of these species, structures like this, even some of the lower head dams, are pretty impassable for these species to make their way up and downstream. So in certain areas, we've been installing fish passages, and in more recent years, we've been starting to try to advocate for removing these structures when it seems necessary, especially if they're no longer serving a real function. So for Westbrook specifically, this site or the pond itself was created about 120 years ago as part of a sportsman's club for hunting and fishing. So it was utilized as such for some time before it eventually became part of Bayard Cutting Arboretum State Park, I believe in the 60s or the 70s. And then it just kind of became part of the park as a occasionally used pond for, I think, some warm-water fishing, if I'm not mistaken. I think maybe people could boat on it too. But it wasn't really utilized as much in later years. And in 2019, a storm, I believe in June, caused the dam weir boards to fail. So that's what this photo on the left is. They were essentially wooden boards that were holding the water back and keeping the pond within that basin. So the storm surge caused all those boards to break and fail. And the photo on the right is right after the pond had failed. So the pond had drained out within a matter of a few days. And this photo was taken, I believe, a few days after the dam had failed. So you could already kind of see that the stream is starting to rechannelize itself. You could kind of see like a very vague corridor of like a channel of water. And all the vegetation that you could see, especially in the foreground of this photo, was all plants that were on top of the pond. So all of these plants had died within a matter of weeks as the pond was drying out. All these plants had died. And you could see there were islands within this pond. So the tree stands are obviously still there. So just to give you a visual, this was taken in February. This is an aerial of the site. And this was taken a couple of months before the dam had failed. And then this was a couple of months after. So you could already start to see that the stream was rechannelizing itself, like I said, and you could already even see some greenery. So some vegetation is growing back in this site, and you could still see, like I mentioned before, the islands that are present. Those are still there, and you could easily spot those out as well. So within a matter of a couple of months, like I said, the pond dried out, the stream started really stabilizing and rechannelizing itself back to its former state. And seeds that had been laying dormant for over a century had started growing back to the site. So this was really exciting for us to see as it was happening. And again, the same aerial from before, just after the dam had failed. It's just a close-up so you could really see a comparison between 2019 and 2023. So even within those last couple of years, you could really see how much the vegetation at this site has really grown, as well as the stream. The stream, the corridor of the stream had kind of widened. It's kind of taken more of a stream-like structure as well. And here's just a good comparison between 2019 and 2023 up close of just how quickly that vegetation has started growing. And for the most part, a lot of this is native plants that we're seeing here. So even though the dam had failed, the structure itself is still there. This photo is taken while standing on the dam. So the dam structure was on the southern side of the pond. So right now we're facing north towards Sunrise Highway. And what's interesting about this photo is that a lot of the plants that you could see along the stream corridor, yeah, there's Phragmites mixed in, but a lot of it is also cattail. There's a good stand of cattail at this site. And we've had people come out and check out this site and are kind of taken away by how much cattail is at this site, because I think for the most part, it's not there's not as much cattail in these types of sites as Long Island continues to urbanize and develop. So this is a pretty unique site for a couple of different reasons, but especially for if you wanted to come and see some cattails. So quickly after the dam failed, we noticed plants were starting to grow, and we wanted to know exactly what was growing here. We're not plant experts, so we had specialists like Steve Young and others from the Long Island Botanical Society come out, and they assessed the site for us in 2019. And Enrico always likes to describe their reaction to the site like they're a bunch of kids in the world's greatest candy shop, because they were just so excited by what they were seeing, what plants were growing here, and just the sheer biodiversity of it all. So within the first year, they surveyed 71 different species, 11 of which are non-native. And then in 2024, the site was reassessed, and we saw 40 species and 4 non-native species. It is important to note that Phragmites had already existed at this site along the northern end of the pond. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like the Phragmite was already here when the pond existed, and as the pond drained, that was a concern for us. So, um, until recently, state parks hadn't decided what to do with the dam, if they were going to rebuild it or not, or leave it as is. And in just this last winter, they finally decided that due to the ecological success of the site, they weren't going to touch it. They're going to leave it as is. But for those first couple of years, up until the last winter, basically, we saw the potential for this site and the risks that it faced with it potentially being consumed by Phragmites. So within those first couple of months, we started tackling the Phragmites. Um, so we're essentially trying to keep the frag at bay. So with the help from consultants like GEI consultants, an environmental firm that we've hired and worked with to help in our efforts, we've been targeting these larger stands of frag, specifically the larger stands that are up by the road. We've been treating those with herbicide. And then the lesser dense areas we've been tackling with our volunteer work days, which is what we will hopefully be doing on Saturday. And we just essentially will be going in mechanically with shovels and manually removing as much frag and the rhizomes as possible. So why Westbrook? Why here? It's a pretty rare find here in Long Island with, like I had said earlier, with Long Island becoming more developed. Sites like this are a rarity. We don't see too many of these habitats anymore, really. And our goal is to preserve this by managing the invasive species, especially the Phragmites. So with current work days and repeated treatments, we have been noticing a decrease in the Phragmites on site. And we just want to give the native plants here a chance to thrive so that this area can eventually turn back to its fully native, natural state of being a riparian forest. So all meadows want to grow up to become forests if the water and resources are there. And obviously, this area is essentially a floodplain or a wetland. So this has the capabilities of turning back into a forest. And so we're hoping to keep the frag at bay long enough for the trees to start growing and out shading and out competing the Phragmites, and eventually, hopefully within the next decade or so, start reverting back into a riparian forest, something that hasn't been seen at this site in over 120 years. So we've been organizing these volunteer work days and working with GEI to controlling the spread of the Phragmites around the pond and the roadway. So we did get state funding from DEC's invasive species management project to maintain this for the next couple of years. So we're just hoping to continue these efforts of keeping the frag away as long as possible for these native plants to really establish themselves and to ensure the site's health for the future. So this was a drone footage taken just last summer, and you could really just see how much native vegetation is really taking over and growing here. And we're all currently standing where the pond basin used to be. We're within the pond itself. And you could see Sunrise Highway just to the upper left there. And this is us working. So definitely by the summer, this vegetation can be above your heads, which is it's pretty cool and exciting. You could see little shoots of Phragmites too. Um, and then in a moment, he's going to pan closer to the stream and you might be able to see the existing dam structure from a distance. But yeah, another thing about this site is that we know that it used to be a forest because along the stream corridor, there are old stumps, and we suspect those stumps are Atlantic white cedar, which was a tree that used to be very prevalent along stream corridors on Long Island, especially in New York. So that would be a species that we would love to see reestablished at this site. Again, the dam structure is just above the 2024 notion on that on the left side. So. So that concludes my talk. And I just want to thank everybody again for taking the time to listen to our talk tonight.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. I have to say, if you have a lot of stress in your life, you got some anger to get out, go to a frag pole. It's a great stress reliever, and you're also doing something for the environment. Highly recommend. Um, awesome. So that's perfect timing Now we're going to go into our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. If you want to share anything with us or each other, like I said earlier, feel free to put that into the chat box. But I did have some emails that were, or some questions that were emailed to me earlier. So I'll start there and we'll see if we have any more questions pop up in our Q&A. So the first question I have is it better to wait until late July or is it okay to cut them earlier throughout the summer? I don't know if anyone has any. If Steve, you wanna, are you able to take that question?
What have you been doing there, Caitlin? Have you been cutting them late?
We start they start popping up in April. And then last summer or last year we went all the way into November, which was it was difficult by that point because we were just looking for the old stands and digging for the roots. Um, I would say there's definitely a window because once the reed itself dies out, then you're just ripping the reed out itself doesn't do anything. You'd have to dig into the ground and pull the rhizomes and the roots out.
All right. Next question is, what native plant species can be planted to compete with Phragmites in a freshwater area?
Well, probably cattail, since that's one of its main competitors.
All right, awesome.
Hmm.
Cattails are so pretty too.
Yeah.
And then the last one is, how important is it to clear away the cut Phragmites? So I guess after it's cut, can you leave it there? Do you have to whisk it away? Katie, you want to take that one?
Um, well, the frag can grow from the seed if the seed heads on it, it could obviously germinate and grow from that. Um, And I believe even if the root is pulled out, I'm not sure how long that's viable for, but I'm sure if you just leave that out, there's a possibility that it could always just reroot itself. Um, I've been told, or I've seen Phragmites is basically like bamboo. Like once it's there, it just keeps growing and spreading and spreading. So I feel like the best thing to do is just to fully remove whatever is there as best as you can.
All right. Let's pull it out, take it all away.
Yeah.
Take it all
Yeah, I
away.
would take it away. I think too, if you have a lot of native plants like at West Pond, just taking the frag out, you don't really have to plant anything new.
Yeah, that's what's
Just
great about that site.
yeah, I mean all that native stuff will just come in on its own,
Mhm.
whatever's there.
Yeah, you can see it already happening. That's
Right.
Mhm.
awesome drone footage. I love that. We have a question from Jimena. Do we know why, this is a question for Steve. Do we know why the invasive frag tends to prefer disturbed soil?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. A lot of invasive species are that way, that they come in disturbance and disturb soil especially.
Mm.
Where you don't have disturbed soil, you often have just native plants. So I'm not sure what the mechanism is on that. I really don't know the physiology of what's taking place there. Maybe somebody else knows, but not sure.
All right. And then Jimena asked also, did you say we should report native frag we see? She just
Yeah,
wasn't sure if she
report the
understood.
native frag to the Rich Ring at the Natural Heritage Program.
All right. And she was
Mhm.
just kind of reiterate like it's that rare that you should report
Yes,
it. All right.
yes, especially Long Island, because as far as I know, there's only one stand.
That's so crazy to think.
Yeah,
There's just
yeah,
one stand somewhere on Long Island.
right.
Wow. All right, thank you. So we have a question from Ezra. I come from a background of studying cattail paludiculture. Paludiculture? Forgive me. Might be a bit of an odd question, but do you think there's any potential in increasing plantings of native Phragmites stands, doing wet agriculture slash paludiculture of the native species, or even incentivizing removal? Or has there been any efforts to establish native stands on the island? Anyone?
I don't know of anyone who's been doing that, establishing native stands. But that would be interesting to do, you know, is like to get rid of some frag somewhere and put in native frag.
Right. Interesting question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ezra. We don't know at this time, but maybe we could look into it. And at the end of our webinars, we also put up a bunch of resources and a follow-up email. So if I find anything, I'll definitely include that. All right. Jimena has another question. Do we know why native frag is so rare? Was it displaced by the invasive frag?
Yeah, I think mainly it was displaced by the native frag. It also tends to be in, especially upstate, it's not here so much, but it tends to be in limey areas, like more in fens and higher pH wetlands than just regular wetlands. So, and there's fewer of those. So I think maybe that's one reason, but also that it's been outcompeted by the non-native one.
I have a question if I can hop in.
Yeah, please.
So Steve, you had mentioned like salt springs around Ithaca where the invasive frag is
Syracuse.
popping up. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Syracuse. I was wondering, is that like naturally occurring salt? And also, since we, use salt on our roads or, liquids with salt content, does it ever happen that like alongside roads where there isn't like natural salt occurring that this frag pops up?
Yes, definitely the salt helps Phragmites spread. Yep. And yeah, those are natural salt springs. And there's a long history of using that salt there. That's why it's called the Salt City. And those natural springs were used to, there's a big salt industry that grew up around that. And actually, it's one of the reasons why they made the Erie Canal, is to get that salt out of Syracuse. But yeah, so there around Syracuse and also in a few other places in that part of the state. There are Montezuma area and a few others. There are natural salt springs, which is kind of cool.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think almost all of them have a Phragmites problem.
So we have another question from the Q&A. We have Luke here who says, forgive me if this was talked about earlier, but is there anything we can do for large stands that are already established? So Katie, you want to take that one?
Well, I know for Westbrook specifically, that site is owned by state parks, so we're in collaboration with state parks to be there, and they know about the workday events that we have, and they approved of the consultants coming in to spraying a specific herbicide that they pretty much checked off on their lists. If it's yeah, if it's more of a like a private property thing, I guess I needed more context of the question. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Let me just go back to it. Is there anything we can do for large stands that are already established?
Oh, yeah, I think the hand pulling events are good for lesser dense areas because it's more manageable, and it could be easier to dig out the roots. When it's a denser stand, I think the only thing you could really do is an herbicide treatment. I think that's the best bet to really make sure that you eradicate it because it spreads so prevalently from the seed heads and from those rhizomes, those roots. So
Yeah, there was a group of people in East Marion on the North Fork who there was a pond there and they had a project where they went in and it was all ringed with Phragmites, and they went in with they cut everything first, and then they herbicided it. And I don't know how that turned out in the long run. I never really heard about that. But then, like in Delaware, where you have huge salt marshes with frag, and they used to use helicopters with herbicide spray.
Yeah.
And then down in, I know in Catskill Marsh along the Hudson, they were using hardware cloth and they were putting that over to smother the Phragmites.
Mm.
And that worked until they found that because they were smothering the Phragmites but keeping other things from growing up, the river was eroding away the marsh
Mm.
because the Phragmites wasn't there anymore to keep it together. So they stopped doing it.
We have some more questions here. We have two from Deborah. At the edge of the pond in Yaphank, there's a large expanding growth of frag, similar to what we were just talking about. Do you have ideas how to curb or eradicate? So it sounds like either pulling or using herbicide, and which follows into our next question. Does herbicide hurt the pond/waterways?
Yes. I mean, that's why, well, aquatic life, although there are certain, I don't know, Cassie, do you know if there are other newer herbicides that don't affect water, like aquatic life as much?
I know that there are aquatic formulations that are said to affect aquatic life less. I don't know to the extent which they're safer, but there's definitely things that have been approved and you're allowed to use to treat, Phragmites and other emergent vegetation in close proximity to water. So you may have to do your own research, and there's lots of resources online if you're looking into that. There's a New York State pesticide website that can provide you label information, and you can consult an applicator for more specific questions and recommendations too.
I know in the Adirondacks, they did a study, the Prism up in the Adirondacks did a study of their work on Phragmites, and they found that the stand doesn't really have to get that large before you just can't get rid of it. And they said as large as a tennis court, but I think probably larger than that. But once you have a fairly large stand of Phragmites, it's just really hard to get rid of it in the long run.
It's tough. Feels like a never-ending battle sometimes, right?
Well, it is. You'd have to do it in perpetuity almost it depends on how much manpower you have and how much money you have.
Right. So since it's almost 8 and we have, I think, perfectly one last question behind, we'll answer that question and then we'll start wrapping up. So a question from Tom, is a permit from the DEC necessary to dig up the roots on private property?
That I'm not sure. I know because we're on state parks, we do have to get approval from DEC for the pesticides or herbicide that we're using. But in terms of private property, I do not know.
I think if it's a wetland, you do, but I don't think if it's an upland, you do. You don't need a permit.
That makes sense.
Mhm.
I think was within 10 feet of a wetland, you have to have some sort of habitat modification permit. But I would suggest checking out DEC's website.
Yeah.
On their permits and licenses webpage. I think there should be a phone number and email there, and you could always reach out to them and double check. They would obviously know best. All right. Awesome. That was a great discussion, great questions. Thank you guys
Yeah,
so
good
much
questions.
for putting those questions in the Q&A and in the chat. I hope you guys had a good time tonight
We
and
did.
learned a little something about Phragmites. Thank you to my panelists for taking the time out of your night to teach us more about Phragmites. And I totally forgot to mention my other panelists here, my co-collaborators, Sally from the SSER, Valerie from PEP, Cassidy from LISMA, and Jimena from Long Island Sound Study New York Sea Grant. Thank you guys, obviously, for everything you do to help create this program and being here tonight. If there are no other questions, or if you think of something and it pops up, feel free to send us an email. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to receive a follow-up email with all of our contact information, a link to the recording, and a link to our Community Science LI webinar page that has all of our future webinars and in-person events. So another just quick plug this Saturday, if it doesn't get rained out, join us at the Frag Pull. And I left in the chat a link to the Westbrook webpage. If you can't make that one or if that one gets rained out, try to join one in the future. And I hope you guys will join us for our next webinar, which will be hosted by Sally, talking all about water chestnuts. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a good night.
Okay. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.